Call this meeting to order. I can see that all commissioners are present. The minutes were emailed to everybody. We need a motion to approve minutes or any additions or corrections if there are any.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved as mailed. We don't have any official action items today. Right to the president's report.
Thank you. If you will recall, in April, we presented to you our plan for asset replacement infrastructure renewal, and then we went into workshop to discuss the financial implications of that program. And then we came back to you in May with some additional input and sought your input into what kind of plan we should have for generating revenue to pay for Century 2. Today, I'm going to ask Mark Walker to present to you the outcome of what we plan to present to you in August for your official consideration of this issue. We will not be voting on anything today. This, again, is more information for your consideration.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. As Ms. Roach just stated, you will recall back at the April meeting, a comprehensive assessment of each utility system's infrastructure was provided to the board, and also an assessment of whether current funding levels were appropriate or on track, or whether additional funding was needed to address system infrastructure needs. You will recall that that report concluded that our wastewater and gas systems, that funding is on track and no additional funds are required for those. However, for our electric and water distribution systems, additional funding is required to address the aging infrastructure. For the electric system, as you know, it is an older system, and several of its major asset components are either nearing the end of their expected service lives, or in some cases have exceeded their expected service lives. For example, certain substation transformers, our underground cable, and also poles. That's electric. With respect to the water system, it's also an aging system. And as we've talked about several times, our water loss trend has been steadily increasing over the last 10 to 15 years to a point where it's reached a level that it's very close to the threshold that has been set by the State Comptroller's Office. So we need to address that, and we need to spend additional dollars to address or to accelerate our water main replacement. With respect to the dollars needed to do that, as we previously discussed, for the electric system, it's almost $10 million per year that needs to be added to the base plan that's already been presented to you. For the water system, it's approximately $4 million per year that's been added to the base plan. And as Ms. Roach also stated, you'll recall at the April meeting, we had the financial workshop, and we discussed some potential funding scenarios for the electric and water Century 2 programs. And we received a lot of good feedback during that meeting, and we've had some individual discussions subsequent to that meeting with the board. And you'll see today in our revised funding plans that we incorporated a lot of that feedback into what we will show you today. And depending upon, I guess, the concurrence of the board and how you feel after today's meeting, we are prepared to bring official action recommendations for you for some of the specific funding items at the August meeting, and we'll go through that in more detail. Prior to getting to the specific systems and the funding for the systems, I just wanted to summarize the key feedback points that came out of the financial workshop back in April. And I suppose first and foremost, what we heard is that there is consensus among the board that we indeed need to resume our electric and water Century 2 programs, and that we need to fund the additional expenditures required to meet those infrastructure needs. With respect to specific funding, however, what we heard that day was consider using higher levels of debt. Spread those costs out over not only current but future ratepayers more so. And also, when you're issuing the debt, look to do longer maturities. Extend the debt service out to provide some additional financial flexibility. And both of those ideas are really, I guess, driven to have smaller rate increases if possible. And you will see that in both the electric and water plans that we've been able to incorporate those recommendations on debt. With respect to the rates themselves, what we heard from the board that day was there is a preference for smaller rate adjustments or rate increases to be implemented annually, as opposed to larger increases implemented every 2 to 3 years. And also within the rate setting, how do you apply those rate increases? The preference we heard from the board was, in particular for residential customers, to assign the rate increase to increase the monthly customer charge for residential customers, as opposed to increasing usage charges. And we do have the flexibility to do that, because you'll recall for both electric and water, our residential customer charges are relatively low compared to other local and regional electric and water providers. And with respect to the last bullet there, the concept was discussed at the April workshop about potentially using special assessments as a tool to raise revenue to fund the Century 2 capital program. And just as a reminder, what we talked about was developing a charge for each customer that would be added to their bill, most likely during the shoulder months, like April and October, really with the idea of filling in the gap. When utility usage is low, you would sort of add that component in on those 2 months, and that would level out charges over the course of the year. We thought about that. We looked back historically at KUB's rate practices, and we determined that we had never actually implemented that type or used a special assessment to fund recurring capital expenditures of that type, such as main replacement or pole replacement. And nor were we aware of any surrounding utilities that had used it in that manner. So we asked our longtime rate consultant, Working Greer, out of Nashville, who has 30 plus years experience consulting and designing rates for water, wastewater, gas utilities, about his experience with special assessments. And what they found was that they are used by utilities from time to time, but exclusively it's been in cases where you have typically smaller systems that are experiencing maybe extensive growth, and they're looking to assign those capacity or cost increases associated with the growth with the customers that are causing them, as opposed to spreading it out over the entire system, looking just at those customers causing the cost increases. They were not aware of any case, such as the capital program we're talking about, where it's recurring capital investment year after year across the system, that special assessments have been used for that. So, though it's an intriguing concept and something that we'll keep in our toolbox as a reminder, at this time, what we're presenting to the board today, there is not a recommendation to use special assessments to bring in additional revenue to fund these programs. Any questions on that? Now we'll turn our attention to the individual systems, first with the electric system. And this chart, you may recognize, this was straight out of Julie Childers' presentation on the infrastructure, on her assessment of the infrastructure in April. But basically it shows the additional funding needed on the electric system and where those additional funds would go. And I just want to spend a moment and review that with the board. Basically that we're looking at adding about $10 million per year for the electric system. Most of that's in capital, a small portion is in O&M, and this chart just simply reflects the capital. But you'll see, where are those additional dollars going? Basically on underground cable replacement, we're going from 7 miles a year to 14 miles per year. So doubling the rate of replacement for underground cable. For wood poles, we're going from 1,300 poles replaced per year to 2,600, doubling the rate of that as well. The other major area is on substation transformer projects, and that's right here. We have several substation transformers that are nearing the end of their service lives that if they did fail, it could cause a significant issue on our system capacity or system voltage. So our plan is to have those all removed from the system in the next 5 years. And that's basically where the additional electric dollars are going. How would the electric system look at the end of 10 years of Century 2 funding? As mentioned, all the high priority substation transformers would have been replaced. 26,000 poles will have been replaced. That's at 2,600 per year. So 20% of our existing electric poles would have been replaced over that period of time. And also with respect to the underground cable, we have a form of underground cable that's called, if I get this right, cross-linked polyethylene, that I believe that all of it is past its expected service life. And what we've noticed with that, we have about 125 miles left in the system. Over the past several years, there's been an increasing failure rate on that underground cable, which is driving up our O&M cost as well. So we want to get all that removed over the course of the next 10 years. And this funding plan would accomplish that.
So most of that downtown?
Actually, it's not. Let me see if I get this right. The downtown cable is a paper-coated cable. Is that correct?
Lead paper.
Lead paper.
Yeah. None of this is in the downtown area.
What is the, you know, we know when we put pipe underground, it's lasts so many years. This new cable that we'll be putting in, does it have a usage life, an estimated usage life?
40 to 50 years. And the old was more like 20 to 25.
And how long will this on average, this cross-link, how long has it been in the ground, roughly?
It's been more than 25 years
Yeah,
already.
because it's all past its useful life. Basically, at the end of 10 years, you would have a newer electric system, a more efficient and reliable electric system with this plan. Now let's turn our attention to the funding of the electric Century 2 over the next 10 years. And we'll start out talking about the debt. And we talked about the feedback from the board during the workshop that the consideration of using higher levels of debt. And we are going to do that with the electric. And the first bullet there says that we're going to increase our maximum debt ratio from 40% to 45%. For many, many years, that's been sort of our cap percentage for the electric system, 40%. We're currently at 35%. But we want to stretch that out, and that will allow us to issue more debt. We also want to extend the maximum debt maturity. Historically, we've done 20 years. But we're going to take that out as far as 30 years. And that will provide additional flexibility and help us also be able to meet our coverage requirement of 3.0. And that's what we've had in place for many years, and we've discussed about the possibility of lowering that as well. But based upon our research, our discussion with our financial advisor, we feel that needs to stay where it is. But I'll point out that these two modifications right here, the first two bullets, allow us to issue an additional $50 million in electric bonds over the next 10 years. And another way to look at that, that's $50 million we don't have to receive from our ratepayers through rate adjustments over the next 10 years. So that is a big deal. Yes, sir.
Have they given any indication on what the additional cost of that borrowing will be?
By extending the maturities out, it's about $80 million over the life of all the debt.
I'm sorry, the difference between if we stay at the present ratios as opposed to going to the increased debt coverage and maturity.
With respect to the cost of the debt,
Yeah, we borrowed 4% now, and it's going to be 4.25% with this, or?
that first bullet isn't going to change that at all.
Okay.
What changes that is the second bullet, because the longer you go out on the yield curve, typically you're going to have a higher rate. And what does that mean going from 20 to 30? It's about 50 basis points. And with all the debt that we have planned over the 10 years, my calculation was it's about 70, 80 million in additional interest expense. Not over this 10-year period, but over the life of all the bonds that we issued. And that's going out past 2050, actually. So it's a very long-term increase in
There's
cost.
also, is it more difficult to sell the longer-term bonds?
No.
Somebody has to be a higher rate?
Well, typically, investors are going to demand some type, anything that goes out longer, typically they're going to say, I want a higher risk premium associated with that because more things could happen over that long period of time. And that's why traditionally that yield curve is sloping upward. Now, depending upon market conditions, that's not always the case. And right now, it's not that upwardly sloping. When we've looked at the difference between 20 and 30 years just a few weeks ago, it's about 50 basis points, which is a range. Did that answer the questions?
I think so.
Okay. But really the key, as I mentioned, that these three bullets right here, it does allow us to issue more debt. The issuance of more debt allows us to keep the rate adjustments smaller than they otherwise would be. And we are proposing in this funding plan to have rate adjustments implemented annually as opposed to every 2 to 3 years. And the level of those rate adjustments in this plan is 1% every year. For the residential customers, what does that mean? Basically, that's $1 added to the monthly bill each year for the next 10 years. Well, we're at the monthly bill would increase. For example, if my monthly bill is $90 right now, next year it'd be $91 monthly bill. Next year it'd be $92. You're going to pay that 12 times, of course, but it's a $1 increase on that monthly bill. And what we're proposing, and we'll be requesting that the board consider 2 electric rate adjustments at the August meeting. And we're proposing that that $1 increase in the residential monthly bill would be in the form or applied to the customer charge, which currently is $10 per month. It would move to $12 per month. And I have a comparison with all other TVA distributors in a moment. I'll share with you on that. But that's what we're proposing with respect to the rates. Also, there will be some impact on commercial industrial bills as well. They will have a share of that 1% increase in revenue. We're still working through the structure of that and how it would be applied to the various rate classes. That will be provided to the board before the August meeting. But, yes, ma'am.
Are you saying there's a 1% usage increase plus a $1?
No.
Okay, that's.
No.
Okay.
The idea behind the rate adjustments is we want to receive an additional 1% in annual revenue. How does that work for the residential? The residential customer's share of that is a $1 increase in their monthly bill.
I like that.
Okay. So this is basically a summary of what comes next. And what comes next, we did put some handouts in your booklet for both electric and water because there's a lot of numbers, I realize, on this chart, and it could be difficult to see. So hopefully that will help out. But obviously a lot of numbers, but what I've highlighted the areas that I wanted to walk through with you, and we'll start down here. And we've already discussed this, but the additional Century 2 investment, again, approximately $10 million per year. You'll note next year it's a little bit less just because of the timing, the startup. The funding wouldn't be approved until, would finalize until September. So we didn't want to put the whole amount in next fiscal year's plan. So that's what's being added. Up here, those dollars would primarily appear on this line item. So they're already embedded into these numbers here for the capital. But I wanted to just bring to your attention specifically the funding items. We'll start up here in the orange with the long-term debt. You can see we're thinking or proposing a bond issue every other year. And in total, that's $265 million over the 10 years. With respect, how does that impact the electric division's debt ratio? Right now, it's around 35%. You can see that will increase over time until it reaches a high of right at 45%, or right at the top of the max ratio in 2018. So we're using additional debt capacity with that $265 million. This here just indicates what's the level of the amortization. It is going out as far as 30 years on all of the proposed bond issues. How does that impact our coverage? Because we want to maintain that 3.0 because we think that's key to maintaining our AA bond rating. And you can see our projected coverage levels are relatively solid. They do begin to dip down and decline as the years go by, ending at 3.11 in 2021. That's an indicator that once you get outside of this 10-year window, if all these things come to pass, that you would probably need a slightly higher rate adjustment sometime down the road, say 2023 or something, but way out there. And then dropping down to the bottom, as we've already discussed, the impact on the residential bill, $1 added to the monthly bill each year. So currently, it's around $90.62. It would increase out to around $101 by 2021. Now, I'll point out that this is based upon monthly usage of 1,000 kilowatt hours, and it does exclude the TVA fuel cost adjustment, which we don't know what that'll be over time. Currently, it's about $4 per month, so that's excluded from this. So this is the actual proposed plan, I guess in all its glory, so to speak. Be happy to answer any questions on it. The keys are increased use of debt. That does help us to keep the rate adjustments down. We are proposing, though, to have small annual adjustments. And then you can see the impact on residential customer bills. But basically, it's adding $1 to the monthly bill each year.
Mark,
Yes, sir.
we talked about this. Do we have to present this every year?
No. Well, what we're going to be proposing specifically for electric is that at the August meeting, you would vote on the first two. Then we would have to come back in future years, you're correct, and consider these other rate adjustments at a future point in time. You might ask, well, why did we not go ahead and do more than two right now? Our concern on electric, more so than water, of course, is TVA. And TVA has given indications that there might be more structural changes, like we had this past April, that come down the pike, which they probably will. And my concern is if we went out and adopted 3 or 4, we might have to go in and reverse and completely flip what we've done and redo it. So I think it would be prudent just to do 2 at this point in time for electric.
However, on that point, it has been suggested by at least a couple of you that maybe there could be a resolution that committed to the 10 years, not in the rate approval, but in the philosophy that there would need to be continuous funding in order to fund Century 2 over the next 10 years. So that would be a substitute for the actual rate increases.
When you say the average monthly customer is 1,000, is it a percentage of the customers you're talking about, or do you just put everybody together?
It's everybody together. It's looking at, now, here's all our residential customers, here's all the kilowatt hour usage divided by the number of customers, and that's the average, yes.
Can I ask about flexibility? Let's say we get a couple of years down the road and we decide this is not a good plan for whatever reason. And I know you can just stop putting in cable or, live with the old poles. Something like a substation upgrade, is that a year-long project? Is that 2 years, or how do you, if we commit to something like that, is that something that's done in a fiscal year, or how does that?
The substation project is one that obviously requires a great deal of planning and commitment before you pull the trigger on constructing it. But it's also one that's not generally built on the speculation of the need. It's usually at a time when you've identified the need, you're building in additional capacities for growth and things of that nature. So it's unlikely that the conditions that would drive that project or require that project would change sufficiently that you'd say, okay, we no longer need this. You might take it out of the 5-year plan before you get to that point, or the long-term plan. But once you've got to the stage of implementation, it's unlikely that you would have anything that would drive a change in that project. But you're right, once you've started, you have long-term delivery schedules and things of that nature. Those, you can make modifications as necessary, but you're not likely to be able to not put in a large transformer if a large transformer is involved in the project. But again, those are changes that are more likely to occur out in the future years when you can make adjustments and modifications as opposed to a project that's already been initiated where it's unlikely that that need would arise.
So the designing, planning, implementing, completing, that's a year at a time, 2 years?
The planning is 3 and 4 and 5 years out. The designing is usually on a substation a year or 2 years in advance sometimes, depending upon the magnitude of it. And then the construction, of course, the construction schedule on the substation will take anywhere from a year to 18 months or longer. So it just depends on the scale and magnitude of the project.
Yes,
I think that the 2-year that does allow us the commitment, if you will, and still flexibility if we're given to make different decisions. That's how you got the 2-year.
yes, sir.
Conceptually, this looks like really what I thought makes some awful good sense. The one thing that seems to be a little askew is the net income. And do we have a provision, or can we be assured somehow that, because we're adding 30% or so to the revenue, and about 25% to the cost, but the net income goes up 100% over those same 10 years. We don't need to make that much money, I don't think. And I would just want to make sure that that we shorten or put it back in, or whatever we're going to do, as opposed to buying next office furniture.
Well, we're not going to do anything like that, trust me. But I'll just point out, you're correct, the net income is going up over time, and that is a function of the rates. But this net income is being used for a purpose. Everything is reinvested back into the system. So just because the earnings are rising, where is that going? It's going into the system infrastructure, and that's why it's rising. Because obviously capital expenditures are deducted through depreciation expense, which, as you know, goes out over a long period of time, the useful life of the asset. But that should not be alarming or thinking that we're getting too much cash than we need or anything like that, because that level of higher earnings just indicates it's going into the system. We have a higher need for infrastructure investment. That's where it's going. Does that make sense?
I guess I just, as opposed to it being a net income number, I think that's a little bit misleading.
It's not a rainy day fund number, and sometimes that's perceived that way. Net income is going back into the next year.
For a
If you knew that the $21 million, if we put $21 million in the polls next year, and that answers the question.
Right.
Okay.
For a nonprofit like KUB, there's really only 2 places this can go. That is to pay principal on debt, which the debt's going up, and to invest into your system infrastructure, and that's where it's going.
Okay.
One other point here I wanted to make on this, and water as well, that in making these changes, in particular for the debt funding strategy, we did sit down with our financial advisor, Joe Ayers of Morgan Keegan, and discuss this with him to see if he had any concerns, in particular from the perspective of the rating agencies. Is increasing our debt ratio, is extending out the debt maturities, is that any concern? Could that potentially result in an impact on our bond rating? And we certainly Joe did not believe that to be the case at all. Based upon our own experience, our own research, we don't believe that to be the case. So we're confident that this would not impact our AA bond rating. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, real quickly.